I'd like to introduce for you our first keynote for today. Matt Eastwood is Senior Vice President of IDC's Enterprise Infrastructure, which also includes cloud, telecom, security, developers, channels, and enabling technology research groups. Matt and his team's research, they research people, process, technology trends affecting the enterprise technology marketplace. He joined IDC in 2000 as part of the server team, and his responsibilities have evolved and expanded during that tenure. He currently leads a team of more than 100 analysts, providing insight, analysis to IT suppliers, buyers, investors, distributors through more than 75 syndicated research programs. He also leads IDC's Buyer's View, which does primary research focused on emerging trends in all these facets of technology. And I know storage has always been near and dear to his heart. And I'd like to welcome Matt Eastwood, IDC.
Thank you, Jay. Appreciate it. Thanks for the introduction, Jay. So when I think back to, so I was in college in the 80s in Boston, and of course, the Celtics teams were a lot of fun. 87 wasn't the best outcome. 86 was a little bit better for us, but those were some seriously short shorts, weren't they? It was an interesting time. So as Jay was saying, my role at IDC is to look after a number of different research programs. And before we dive into this, so two things. The presentation, the talk I'll give is fairly high level. It's really going to provide a little bit of an arc and a little bit of a narrative around the transformation we see happening in digital infrastructures and really how that's been impacted by the pandemic and what's happened in the last couple of years. But this is the first time I've actually stood on a physical stage in, well, since a little while now, so be kind to me. I'll wander a little bit and try to not to fall off. But we're going to look at cloud adoption. We're going to look at kind of the maturity of the market. And Jay mentioned Buyer View, the primary research. I'll use a lot of research from our Cloud Pulse, which is a quarterly kind of snapshot of what's happening with adoption around cloud. And I'll be using that today to kind of illustrate where we are with these various elements of this transformation that's happening. So the market is also a little bit choppy, a little bit chaotic right now. The last couple of years, we went through this period where we had to shift everybody to remote work, remote learning. There were a lot of investments, particularly on the end user side, on the device side, to keep everybody functional and productive. And then last year, we started to see a little bit of a move back into enterprise spend and some investments in things inside the data center to really help with this pivot to really a hybrid stance that a lot of organizations were taking. And then, of course, now, all the news is doom and gloom. We certainly see, inflation and inflationary pressures, supply chain challenges, war, all kinds of things that are really, I think, putting a little bit of a pause on some of what's happening in the industry. But we're still very bullish about what's happening with technology overall. So let's dive into this. So first of all, when we think about the pandemic and the impact it definitely had this effect of accelerating this transition to digital. People really started to think digital first, and that really became the kind of the position that you needed to have in the industry. The technology leaders that were really deploying and adopting this technology, their role was very much about keeping the lights on, keeping things moving. And honestly, there was a lot of recognition for all the goodness that they were doing, how difficult it was in such short notice to really pivot in an organization and keep things productive. And this digital economy really got kind of a boost from all this. It got a really kind of a kick in the pants, and it really helped drive people. It drove a lot of awareness around how important digital was. And so we saw this great acceleration happening. It was really a wake-up call also for the infrastructure underneath. So when I think about the transformation digitally of a business, in simple terms, what I think about is really kind of not only defining your business and apps and data, but it's really about differentiating the business using applications and data. And so it's this distributed set of applications and data that not only lives in data centers, that could be on-prem, it could be a public cloud, but also at the edge. So there's this continuum of apps and data that's really being deployed. And this notion of digital first applies to all organizations. It could be public sector, could be a for-profit enterprise, could be an educational institution. Really, everyone is impacted by this. And it's really about enhancing the outcomes using these digital capabilities. So it's a little bit of a pivot to the experience that you're providing to whomever you're trying to serve with the infrastructure, with these apps and with this data. It's not a business model. It's really more of an aspiration or a goal. And as you can see, about just under 80%, 78%, actually saw the pandemic as a catalyst to driving deeper with all of this. And almost 90% are executing on this digital first strategy today. And then you'll see on the left that little 2% that said they're really not doing anything here. Well, we should probably wish them all well. They're not going to be around all that long. Okay, so there are lots of technologies that are impacting or being impacted by this transition. But there are 4 here that I think are worth highlighting because they really do kind of provide some context for what some of the challenges are that organizations are facing. So if we think about trust and security in general, when you did see this rotation towards more of a distributed infrastructure, distributed people, data and applications moving around, it did open us up. The posture that historically has been in place for most security is really about keeping everyone out, building this ring. And now, of course, we have to protect all of this data, all of these applications while it's in motion. So the security model's way, way too complicated still. And so there's a lot of focus here on simplifying and bundling these technologies, making them easier to implement, making them much, much less of a heavy lift. And then, of course, with cloud became the easiest way to stand up a new service during this pandemic. And so it did even further the acceleration to cloud. Now, I'll just say that when I think of cloud, I don't think of it as a destination. It's not, I'm in the AWS data center or a Google Cloud data center. I think of it more as an operating model for the IT that's really powering these digital businesses. So it's really not just about a public offering. It's oftentimes a lot of dedicated cloud as well. It's about the edge. It's about the core. There's a lot that's happening underneath this cloud. But it's also, and I think for all the folks here at the Flash Memory Summit, there's a lot of innovation happening in these clouds, whether these are dedicated clouds that are being offered or services that are being offered by the HPEs or Dells of the world, or what's happening with the AWSs and Googles and Microsofts of the world. There's a lot of innovation, particularly from those public cloud providers, in the silicon and the enabling tech inside of their infrastructure because they need to compete on price performance and they're looking for any differentiatable value that they can provide so that they're not just commoditized in having the same offerings as everyone else. With software, we see interesting things here as well. Everybody sort of is defining themselves in software, and software's been defined as kind of the future of where we go to innovate. But we also see a lot of organizations trying to build their own ecosystems around their applications. So these become very vertically intensive in terms of the industries that you're in. So certainly in retail and distribution and healthcare, there's a lot happening around software and trying to bring people into this ecosystem. So all the folks that partner with a really large organization and say the Global 100 or Global 500, they're increasingly trying to influence that. And then finally on edge, 60% of the data is actually created at an endpoint, and the apps we know will follow the data, and of course the infrastructure needs to follow that data as well. So point here is the IT layer that lives at the edge, the operational technology layer, which is going to be very vertically kind of specific, and also the communications technology layers. They're all blending together, so there's kind of new ecosystems forming because of what's happening at the edge, and they tend to be a little bit more vertically oriented than what we've seen in the past. So it all starts with data. IDC's had this global data sphere for a long time, but we see data growing 25, 30, even 40% a year. This is a data creation view. This is not a view of kind of data at rest, but it just shows how much information is moving around our networks, how much information is out there potentially to provide fuel for these analytics. But essentially, there will be more data created in the next 2 to 3 years than in the last 40 years. So, that's a story we hear an awful lot, and certainly the space that we serve here at Flash Memory is very much on top of what's happening here. The one point I would make here is about 20% of this data that's coming at us will be real time. And it introduces new opportunities to do different types of analytics, including at the edge. So there's new opportunities that spin up because of this, but also a lot of complicating factors. We also see more application and data dependencies emerging, which is also influencing kind of where organizations want to run these applications, where they want to deploy the infrastructure, because these data sets and these applications are oftentimes very, very tightly aligned. So when we think about the application, so we pivot from apps, from data into apps, they're changing as well. So you can see, there's a lot of promise around multi-cloud, but we're seeing these applications move into more of a componentized view, so a lot more use of things like Docker and Kubernetes. What this means, though, is that every cloud today, if you're living in some sort of multi-cloud context, has its own unique set of tools and policies, and that creates more of a challenge for the end user as well. More and more of these applications, as I said, are going to be built with these modular frameworks. These resources increasingly, particularly if these are new applications, they're going to live in places they haven't been deployed in before. So there's complexity that comes about in the application layer as well. And just like I was mentioning with data, there are more application dependencies emerging here as well. So that's starting to influence what good cloud governance needs to look like and how we think about managing these environments. All right, so foundationally, if I think about this digital infrastructure, there are these 3 dimensions that we think are really what most end users are thinking about the most. We touched on location already. That's this notion of this distributed infrastructure that stretches to the edge. But it's really about how we wrap a governance model and new data management competencies around this distributed infrastructure. These 3 dimensions, so there's the location piece, where do we want to have this infrastructure along this continuum, pretty self-explanatory. There's the consumption piece, which is how do I actually want to acquire access to this infrastructure, this technology? Do I want to use a traditional CapEx model? Do I want to, buy? Do I want to rent? Or do I want to actually go with more of the Uber model or the cloud model where you're kind of pay per use? So all 3 of those are openly being considered, and what I would typically see is people tending to want to own the base load wherever they can because the economics will generally be better, and they're going to try to rent or use as a service models for either peaks or things that they don't understand quite as well. So where they can't maybe provide as much context around the infrastructure requirements, the overall capacity planning needs, they may rotate to more of an as-a-service model. And then finally, on the asset usage piece of this, that's where we start to think about whether this is a shared infrastructure or a dedicated infrastructure. And what we do tend to see, and I'll show you in a little bit, is the more advanced organizations that have been using kind of cloud as a foundation for their infrastructure longer, they tend to think about this asset usage model the most closely, and they have the most evolved thinking, but they're also more likely to be using dedicated instances for many of these very critical workloads that they're differentiating around. So the focus really moves to the operational complexity, and what organizations are going to try to do is really overhaul the infrastructure, because really what's foundational to all of this, if you think about what we talked about with data and a little bit with applications. So I mentioned data's doubling every 2 to 3 years. Applications are doubling every 4 to 5 years. It's about scale. Most organizations that are just kind of scratching the surface here have no idea how much scale is going to come at them. And the fact of the matter is they're going to have to be highly automated to get through this journey. Okay, so edge. Talked about it already, but essentially what we see is almost 3/4 of the organizations we're talking with today see the edge as a strategic area that they will invest. And almost 95% of edge deployments will be built using a cloud native platform. So the edge and the cloud, these are lights out locations. They're going to be very much software-defined, kind of cloud-first types of efforts. These edge cloud services are, moving closer to the customer. That's the intent, is really to get the application, the analytics, and the real-time decision-making closer to where that user lives and where that data is being created. But it's also important to note that this isn't necessarily all new. So edge could be, a remote branch office. We've been dealing with that for decades. It could be a telco environment. It could certainly be kind of a network edge cloud environment. So think about an Equinix data center. It could be an industrial location. That's where things start to get more vertical. So it could be the hospital. It could be the retail store. It could be a manufacturing environment, automated manufacturing. It could be some kind of industrial environment. It's all of that. The goal is to really gather, to analyze, to learn, to inform, and to actuate a decision in as close to real time as possible. And you can expect to see some new competition for how we monetize in this space. So as I mentioned earlier, these IT and OT and communications technology layers are converging, and it's creating kind of new opportunities for all of us. With operations, so the industry is moving from human scale to cloud scale. So we used to build for what we knew. It was really about supporting people, but now we're building for data and device loads that we never could have imagined before. So we go from hundreds of millions to billions to even potentially trillions of devices hanging on these networks. This drives a shift toward much more intelligent cloud operations and task and workflow automation. So the automation needs to be embedded in the cloud services themselves or in the infrastructure. We're going to see both happen. And this is leading to spending shifts into things like observability and AI. The decision-making will center really on these workflows. And this is also going to influence the IT skills that are required. And new skills will need to come along to really embrace these new tool sets that are building around observability. Observability integrates all of this. It integrates the logs. It integrates the AI and ML. And the goal here is really to coordinate events and also orchestration so it's about automating and orchestrating around these events. And it's really the only way we can achieve the scale that's coming at all of us. So the hyperscalers sort of went down this path first, and now the traditional digital enterprise is going right there with them because of the same challenges will be faced. So this all impacts the ecosystem too. So when we think about kind of partnering and how things come together in the field with the channel, suppliers and all of their partners really need to determine where they can best add value in the marketplace. And in the old model, it really involved kind of buying the pieces and integrating them in the field, and that was really the output. The VAR was adding that value. They were bringing all these different pieces in place. They were integrating and deploying and collecting and getting paid on the back end of that. The new model is very focused on outcomes, and it's really about how you partner inside of this cloud ecosystem that's quite broad, or multiple cloud ecosystems even. But everybody that was monetizing in the third-party partner model before is redefining themselves as well. So you have ISVs, you've got VARs, you've got SIs. They're all building new managed services. They're building new SaaS offerings. They're all looking for ways that they can build up their own skills and deliver on these outcome-oriented conversations in the marketplace. This changes the participants. It changes the personas. And new selection criteria come along, and we actually think we're going to start to see a lot more ESG influence here as well. So when you start to think about data center, a lot of it will start to focus on the environmentals, and they're going to expect that their suppliers and the partners that they work with prove out that they're doing their part in terms of being an efficient organization in terms of how they bring these services to market. Okay, so we'll go through the cloud adoption piece of this now. Workloads are still the critical area, I think, for these discussions. They always have been. They really influence what these decisions look like and what these infrastructures look like. The hybrid world will increasingly favor a mix of public and private, these shared and dedicated environments. Half of all organizations today, a lot of people are kind of surprised when they hear this, have still never run a production application in a public cloud. Now, that doesn't mean half of the market, because these tend to be smaller and generally less sophisticated, but there's still a fairly long tail when we start to think about cloud adoption and what that's going to look like over time. The more mature organizations, of course, look quite a bit different here. As I mentioned, they're likely to be favoring more of a dedicated or more of a hybrid model that includes a lot of private as well. But clearly, this notion of hybrid is here to stay. And when we think about this, so this is a bit like watching paint dry. There's a pronounced move away from legacy and towards this cloud-based digital infrastructure, as we've been talking about. There's a large rate of churn in these applications. So, many times people will paint this picture as, well, it's a unidirectional journey to the public cloud. Now, there's definitely more momentum around the build and deployment in public clouds than what's happening on-prem, but there's also a lot of applications that move in and out of these environments all the time. So if you think about it from a portfolio perspective, what the customers are saying to us is they've got traditional IT environments, they've got private clouds, they've got hosted private clouds, they've got public cloud usage models, they've got SaaS applications, and they're moving workloads in and out of these all the time. So it's really, really dynamic, and it really does set up the need for tools and also operating processes that really allow us to wrap kind of a governance model around all of that. So it's not a unidirectional journey, and the focus is really on these management tools. The private and public considerations are quite high. We still have a long way to go with this journey overall. The focus is moving from lift and shift and rehost models and into this cloud-first model, which is really defined by how these new applications are built, these new componentized cloud-native applications. And there's a mix of public, shared, and private dedicated that will actually come out of this on the back end. There's also a new competitive landscape that comes about because of this. So you see all the traditional infrastructure OEMs, whether it's a Dell or an HPE or a Lenovo, Pure, Cisco, they're all kind of talking about how they want to deliver more of a competitive as-a-service offering for these dedicated environments. And then, of course, you have the public cloud providers also providing, whether it's an Anthos or an Outpost, that is all happening here as well. So this churn that's happening, and it's really towards this movement that's really towards the cloud. As I said, it's not unidirectional. Enterprises are clearly looking for help in the performance monitoring and also the cost management, the automation, and their capacity optimization around all of this. It's not an easy thing for them to wrap their arms around. You have a lot of, as I was saying, new personas popping up, people influencing what's happening at various points in these infrastructures, and they're really trying to get their arms around it. And I would say that if there is any, this economic headwind that we're facing into right now or leaning into right now, we will, for the first time, see some pressure on some of these as-a-service budgets. Because, and I'm going to go into that next, there's definitely concern that there's an inefficient use of a lot of the resource that folks are paying for. But before we go there, if you think about the people piece of this, that's being impacted pretty significantly as well. What most organizations want to do is, of course, they want to focus on things that are truly differentiable for them, and they want to move out of things that are not. And that is true for where they put their people as well. So you can see in the bottom left here, those are areas where they want to spend less time, and then the upper right are places that they want to spend more time. And so clearly being more proactive would be the story here. So security, not from the posture of kind of really defending on things that have already happened, but getting ahead of things that might happen, so that they don't have to deal with some sort of denial of service attack or some kind of a breach that may happen. And the same with planning and design and orchestration. They want to really get ahead there so they're less reactive. So if you think about it this way, most IT has roughly been 70 or 80% maintenance. If you think about the IT budget, 20, 30% going into new things, new innovation. It's a massive hairball out there. It's that these install bases are decades old. But what they want to do is shift more of that into innovation. So instead of being 70 or 80%, keep the lights on, they maybe want to be 50% or 60%. There's a goal to get there and to be more proactive. So cloud spend, it's continued to rise, and it rose very, very pronounced, in a very pronounced way during the pandemic. The cloud makes up about 30 to 40% of a typical IT budget today, so it's significant. As a percentage of IT spend, we see 90% of organizations planning to or expecting to grow their cloud spend next year. This is primarily true among the larger, more sophisticated firms. And again, when we think of cloud, it could be this dedicated private or the public cloud. But there's a focus on cloud economics that's happening as well. It's really focused on really making sure that there's an efficiency of these resources, that it's effectively being applied to the business. And obviously, when there's budgetary pressure from above, people are going to really look closely at this, which really sets this up. So today, about 65% of the organizations we're talking to are believing that their cloud overspend is high or even very high. So this is primarily true with things like the core hardware that they're leveraging, as well as some of the public cloud services that they leverage. And if you think about what I said earlier, the cloud service providers are trying to really differentiate around some of these higher value, custom silicon-based instances that they're selling. That's where there's likely to be a bit more pressure than we would have expected a few years ago. So remember, most of the software that runs in these clouds is open source. So truly the differentiatable value, if you're a service provider, is really in that core infrastructure stack. So that's where a lot of their focus lives. So total cloud spending will continue to rise in 2022, but we do expect that there'll be some shifts inside of who the winners and losers are in some of this, because it's been kind of up and to the right for the last decade, but there'll be more scrutiny going into this decision making as a result of some of the budgetary pressures that folks are feeling. Smaller firms are really struggling with some of these operational expense shifts away from CapEx. Smaller firms tend to follow the advice of the suppliers that they work with, but when you get into the mid-market, they tend to resist a little bit, and they try to sweat these assets a little bit more. So they tend to lean a little bit more in on CapEx-heavy models still. But we need to think about what the right consumption model will look like for some of these smaller companies, because they really don't have the scale that will really allow them to measure the effectiveness of this shifts in the way a big enterprise would. So the most important cloud investments over the next 2 years are really going to be, in general, around things like cost management, containment, and features that are really prominent and really important for most enterprises. Investments in comprehensive security, in backup and disaster recovery will still be very, very prevalent in what they're trying to achieve and what they're going to put their funds into. They are not in any way looking to reduce the number of IT staff out. Most of them don't have enough people as it is. They're looking to really leverage the staffs they have to augment them, to make them more scalable, if you will, to be able to deal with all these applications and data that are really kind of inundating their business. So last couple slides, as I'm right at time here, is dedicated cloud. So we see an awful lot. I mentioned all the OEMs and also the cloud service providers kind of moving in on this. This represents the new competitive battleground in the marketplace, where you're seeing the public clouds and the traditional infrastructure suppliers going head to head to really influence what's going to happen in the world that's really defined by the need for dedicated infrastructure, either at the edge or in the core, whether it's in an enterprise data center or a hosted location. This often includes a number of managed services. It can be deployed, as I said, on-prem or in a hosted environment, but there's a lot here that's going to focus on things like compliance. They're going to focus on security and performance and other drivers. And to just give you a snapshot on the opportunity we see here, it's fairly significant. It's early days, but we think that over the next 3 or 4 years, this will really be what defines the enterprise infrastructure market in the future. Initially, most of the growth will be in traditional data centers that are enterprise-owned, where they're looking at a different consumption model and a different way of embedding and deploying technology, but they're still going to be in the IT business. But over time, you're actually going to see more of the growth coming from these dedicated infrastructures, but they're going and being deployed in service provider data centers. So it could be a Digital Realty or an Equinix, but there'll be a lot more of a rotation into a third-party data center over time. So you'll start to see the mix in this change as we move forward. All right, so just to wrap, if I think about this market, I think about ESG, it's really begun to really influence how people think about making decisions around technologies. That's clearly not going to change, at least in the near term. I've been to 7 or 8 events this year, live events like this, and ESG has been prominently featured in all of them. Edge, we've talked about, we definitely see Edge requiring this tight collaboration between the lines of business, the folks that are actually doing data management, that are actually responsible for managing these applications. It brings different constituencies together in new and interesting ways. And then with automation, we talked about the scale that's coming. Essentially, what we need to do is really understand what these outcomes that customers value really mean in terms of how these infrastructures are being deployed and managed. And then finally, the OpEx procurement piece of this. As I said, a lot of the interest is in places that are less understood, including at the edge in terms of what the capacity requirements will be, what the economics look like. So there's a general hedge of risk that a lot of enterprises are thinking about in terms of passing this off to one of their providers. They're going to pay a premium for that, but when there's something that they don't feel comfortable kind of measuring and managing themselves, they will look for a partner to step in. All right, so just to kind of close out, the transformation in these organizations, these apps and data are really redefining what the digital business looks like, and of course, that has a big impact on the underlying infrastructure, where it's deployed, how it's managed. The IT being redistributed to the intelligent edge will require new AI-based management models because, again, the scale will require that we think about a management model that's quite different from what we've known historically. Then the cloud will provide this operating model. We think of this as frictionless connectivity, frictionless deployment, and frictionless operations. It's all about going from that world that was human scale into this world that's cloud scale, and going from millions to hundreds of millions to billions and potentially trillions of devices kind of feeding these data and application streams that we're using to really differentiate. And then finally, this multi-cloud environment can offer the governance and optimization requirements that are necessary. But just remember, as I said, with the economic headwinds that we're facing, we think that there'll be more scrutiny on some of these as-a-service budgets. And a lot of the service providers that live in those spaces have actually never felt these types of challenges in the past. So we're going to start to see SaaS providers, PaaS providers, IaaS providers all having some scrutinization of what's being spent with them for the first time probably ever. So hopefully that provides a little bit of context for what we see happening at that high level, a little bit of a story around how we see the cloud evolving. I want to thank all of you. I'll be hanging out in the back if anybody wants to chat after this. But thanks for your attention. Thanks for making this a painless re-entry to a live stage. But thanks, and hopefully the rest of the day goes well for you. Thanks, Jay.